Isabelle blinked into the quiet, dimly lit morning. The familiar shadows in her room seemed a little off, as if they had gathered in corners she hadn't noticed before. She pushed herself up, head pounding with a dull ache, her vision blurred. The space around her felt denser than usual. As she sat up, Isabelle noticed that the ticking of her old bedside clock was strangely muted, almost like it was coming from underwater. She rubbed her eyes, shaking off the last tendrils of sleep. But when she glanced at the window, she paused, squinting against the thin morning light filtering through her heavy curtains. It was as if the light was softer, more diffused, casting an unusual pallor over everything it touched. Yawning, she ran her hand over the frilly edges of her bedspread, noting the slight chill in the fabric. Usually her mornings greeted her with warmth from the sun, filtering through her lacy curtains and bouncing off the light yellow wallpaper she adored. Yet today the air was cold, untouched by the warmth of daylight. As she stretched, her eyes wandered across her bedroom, noting the familiar but comforting clutter book stacked high on her nightstand, a half-burned candle from last night's reading session, and the collection of old photos on the dresser. But there was something strange about these photos today. The faces, her own included, seemed slightly blurred, as if fading into the background. She shook her head, convinced it was just the fog of sleep still clinging to her. Isabelle slipped into her favorite pair of slippers and wandered downstairs, hoping that a cup of coffee would shake off the morning's oddness. The stairs creaked beneath her feet, the only sound in the stillness. Her house, usually filled with the hum of small noises, the ticking clock, the groan of the old water heater, seemed almost eerily silent, each creak of the stairs amplified in the void. The familiar sense of her home, old wood, lavender from a bowl of potpourri, the faintest hint of her perfume were there, but muted, almost as if something were dulling them. She shook off the sense of unease, brushing it aside as the result of a poor night's sleep. The kitchen was cold, a far cry from the warm, inviting space it usually was in the morning light. She opened the curtains and blinked at the world outside. Even the garden seemed dulled. The colors in the flowers, once vibrant, looked washed out, like an old photograph left in the sun too long. The street beyond her picket fence was empty, shrouded in a faint mist that softened the edges of every shape and color. Isabelle filled the kettle, and the faint whoosh of the gas burner was barely audible. She stood by the window, watching the steam rise, her gaze distant. The quiet wasn't comforting. It was as if the world outside her door was holding its breath, waiting. After making herself a cup of coffee, she returned to the window, sipping slowly and trying to ground herself. But as she watched the street, a deep-seated restlessness stirred within her. She could feel the emptiness pressing in, heavy and strange. She shook her head, clearing away the unsettling feeling and trying to reason with herself. "It's just one of those days," she murmured into the silence. "Probably just the weather." But as she set her cup down, the faint clink sounded muffled, like the cup had hit the counter through layers of cloth. She frowned, glancing down at her cup, as though it were to blame for the strange silence. This wasn't right. Her home felt muted, ghostly. She could feel herself slipping, her thoughts clouded by an ever-deepening unease that she couldn't quite shake. In hopes of clearing her mind, Isabelle slipped on her coat and headed outside, hoping a brisk walk would ease her nerves. As she stepped onto her front porch, she drew in a deep breath of the chilly morning air. The street lay quiet and empty, muffled in a haze of mist. The air felt thick, as if carrying an invisible weight, and even her footsteps were muted on the gravel path. Isabelle's neighbors usually began their day early. The Smiths, right across the street, had 3 young boys who were always running around by now, laughing and shouting as they waited for the school bus. But the street was eerily still, devoid of its usual sounds and activity. Even the occasional hum of a passing car was missing. The only sound was the faint crunch of her own footsteps, swallowed up by the fog as soon as they echoed. Across the street, she saw Mrs. Turner, her elderly neighbor, in her garden as always. Mrs. Turner's roses were her pride, meticulously pruned and kept vibrant with shades of pink and red, even in the cooler seasons. But today even the roses looked dull, their petals losing the familiar depth of color. Mrs. Turner's back was turned, her small frame hunched over a particularly rebellious bush. Isabelle smiled, feeling a rush of relief at seeing her neighbor. She raised a hand, calling out, "Good morning, Mrs. Turner." But Mrs. Turner didn't react. She continued to prune the rose bushes, her movements slow, almost mechanical, as she clipped each thorny stem with precision. Isabelle's smile faltered. She tried again, this time louder, "Mrs. Turner, beautiful day, isn't it?" Still, Mrs. Turner didn't respond. Her head remained bent over her work, the soft snip of her pruning shears the only reply. Isabelle frowned, taking a hesitant step forward. Surely Mrs. Turner hadn't suddenly gone deaf. She was always so alert, so quick to wave and exchange a bit of neighborhood gossip. She took another step, her hand half raised in an uncertain wave, but the closer she got, the more she noticed an odd stillness to Mrs. Turner, like she was moving on autopilot. Her expression was vacant, her eyes focused on the roses with a gaze that seemed blank, as though she were looking past them. Isabelle felt a chill creep up her spine and she shivered, suddenly unsure whether to approach any closer. She bit her lip, watching Mrs. Turner for a moment longer, and then, trying to shake off her discomfort, she continued down the sidewalk. She told herself it was nothing, maybe just a senior moment. Still, she couldn't quite dispel the eerie feeling that something wasn't right. Down the street, she saw Mr. Jenkins, another neighbor, standing in his yard with his dog, Duke. Usually Duke would come bounding over at the sight of her, barking with excitement and wagging his tail like mad. But today he sat perfectly still at Mr. Jenkins's feet, staring straight ahead with glassy, unblinking eyes. Isabelle hesitated, giving a small wave to Mr. Jenkins, who usually offered a cheerful hello, but he too seemed out of sorts, standing motionless with a vacant stare. It was as if he was stuck in a daze, oblivious to everything around him. She called out, "Hello, Mr. Jenkins. Morning walk." Mr. Jenkins didn't so much as blink. He remained as he was, staring into the distance with a fixed, almost eerie stillness. Even Duke, usually so lively and responsive, didn't react. Isabelle's chest tightened as a chill of dread washed over her. This wasn't normal. She took a step closer, calling his name again, louder this time. "Mr. Jenkins, are you all right?" No response. She was close enough now to see the vacant expression on his face, his eyes glassy and unfocused, as if he were looking through her rather than at her. Isabelle took a step back, heart pounding. She felt an odd prickling sensation, like something cold and heavy had settled in the pit of her stomach. Just then, a movement caught her eye. Sarah, the teenager who lived a few houses down, walked briskly past, her gaze fixed straight ahead. Normally, Sarah would nod or wave, maybe even stop for a quick chat. But today she passed by without so much as a glance, her expression blank, as though Isabelle were invisible. Isabelle's mouth went dry as she stared after Sarah. She felt an unsettling awareness, a creeping realization that she couldn't shake. Her neighbors weren't just ignoring her. They were acting as though she didn't exist at all. The air grew colder, pressing down on her with a strange weight. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but her heart raced. She could feel her pulse quicken, each beat echoing louder in the silence around her. She was alone, truly alone in a way she hadn't felt before. She glanced back at Mrs. Turner, still trimming her roses with vacant eyes, and Mr. Jenkins, frozen in place with his dog. A quiet sense of panic rose in her chest as she whispered, "What's happening?" The world around her felt muted, distant, as though she were separated from everything by an invisible wall. Her voice barely made a sound, swallowed up by the fog, as soon as the words left her lips. The further Isabelle wandered from her house, the more the world around her seemed to stretch, grow quieter and pull away, as if she were walking through a dream. She felt unsettled, noticing how her footsteps grew softer, her movements slowed. A growing tension filled her chest, making her feel heavier with each step. As she neared her favorite little coffee shop on the corner, she felt a sense of relief. Stepping through the glass door, she was greeted by the familiar warmth and aroma of freshly brewed coffee. A small bell chimed as she entered, a comforting sound she had come to love over the years. The barista, Ben, usually greeted her with a smile and asked if she wanted her usual order, a cappuccino with a dash of cinnamon. But today Ben was busy at the counter, seemingly absorbed in preparing orders. Isabelle gave him a friendly wave, but he didn't look up. She shifted awkwardly, waiting for him to glance her way or notice her presence. But Ben continued working, moving from one coffee machine to the next, carefully pouring milk into steaming cups, as if she weren't there at all. Feeling slightly embarrassed, Isabelle walked up to the counter, tapping lightly on the polished wood to get his attention. "Hey Ben, could I get my usual?" But he didn't respond. He simply wiped down the counter, focused on the next customer in line. Isabelle frowned, casting a glance around to see if anyone else had noticed her. The customers at the tables were quietly chatting, sipping their drinks, reading newspapers, but no one acknowledged her. It was as if she had become invisible. A hint of desperation welled up within her. She spoke louder, leaning forward slightly. "Ben, are you ignoring me on purpose?" She gave a little laugh, trying to brush off her anxiety, but her words dissolved into the background hum of the cafe, unheard and unanswered. The barista took the next person's order, a young man who stood only a few feet away from Isabelle. As the young man gave his order, Isabelle noticed that Ben looked directly at him, smiling warmly as he poured the coffee, handing it over with a cheery "enjoy your day." Isabelle's heart sank. She had been coming to this cafe for years. Ben had remembered her name even after her very first visit. He knew her order by heart, always adding that extra dash of cinnamon she loved. Yet now his eyes passed right over her, without even a flicker of recognition. She took a step back, trying to suppress the unease that gnawed at her. Maybe he was just distracted. Maybe the morning rush had him too preoccupied to notice her. But deep down, she knew that wasn't it. The sensation of distance, of separation, was growing stronger. The world around her was slipping further away, like she was a figure in a fading photograph. As she looked around, Isabelle realized that even the sounds in the cafe were muffled, as if wrapped in a thick layer of fog. The clinking of mugs, the chatter of customers, the hiss of the espresso machine all felt strangely distant, echoing in a way that didn't quite reach her ears. Unable to bear it any longer, she turned and left the cafe, the bell above the door chiming faintly behind her. Stepping outside, she felt a shiver run down her spine. The chilly air seemed to seep into her bones, making her feel strangely hollow, as though something vital within her was slipping away. She quickened her pace, hoping to shake off the growing sense of dread that clung to her like a shadow. She told herself that it was just an off day, that she would laugh about this strange morning later. But as she walked, the familiar street seemed more alien with every step. Even the colors of the buildings and trees appeared muted, washed out, as though she were seeing them through a fogged lens. She looked around, hoping to see a friendly face, anyone who might reassure her that she was still part of this world. But the street was nearly empty, and the few people she passed walked by without so much as a glance in her direction. She felt a strange heaviness in her chest, a growing fear that something was terribly wrong. Isabelle found herself back in her own neighborhood, the familiar houses lining the street. Yet each house, each yard, felt strangely distant, as though a thin veil separated her from everything she saw. Her steps felt heavier as she approached her home, the sense of isolation pressing down on her with a suffocating weight. Inside, the house felt colder than it should have, the silence wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. She shivered, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a family photo on the mantel. The frame was familiar, the glass smooth beneath her fingers, but when she looked closely at the image, her heart skipped a beat. In the photograph, her family was gathered around the dinner table, smiling warmly, but her own face, it was different. The edges were blurred, her features indistinct, like a watercolor painting left in the rain. The more she looked, the more her image in the photo seemed to dissolve, fading into the background. A cold dread filled her as she stared at the picture, gripping the frame tightly. She picked up another photograph, a family picnic from years ago. In this one too, her face was blurred, almost like she was slowly vanishing from the picture altogether. She set the frame down carefully, her hands shaking. Isabelle took a deep, trembling breath, trying to calm herself. She reached for her phone, desperate to hear a familiar voice, someone who could pull her back into reality. She dialed her best friend, Lily, pressing the phone tightly to her ear as it rang. The line crackled with static, the sound faint and distant. Isabelle's heart pounded as she listened, straining to hear a voice through the distortion. "Lily," she whispered, her voice barely audible, even to herself. The static grew louder, a hissing noise that seemed to fill her head. She tried again, raising her voice. "Lily, it's Isabelle. Can you hear me?" But there was no answer. The line was filled with nothing but the endless hiss of static, an unbroken silence that stretched on and on. She clutched the phone tightly, her knuckles white, her heart racing with a mix of frustration and fear. It was as if she were calling from somewhere far away, reaching out into an endless void. She tried dialing other numbers, her family, old friends, but each call was met with the same eerie silence, the same static that filled her ears and left her feeling more alone than ever. Isabelle lowered the phone, a hollow emptiness settling over her. It was as though she were slipping out of existence, vanishing from the memories of everyone she knew. The isolation wrapped around her, heavy and cold, pressing down on her until it felt like she could barely breathe. She stumbled to the mirror in the hallway, her reflection staring back at her with a haunting emptiness. Her features looked slightly blurred, like the faces in the photographs, as if she too were fading from reality. She touched her face, half expecting her fingers to pass through her own skin. "What's happening to me?" she whispered, her voice barely a whisper, swallowed by the silence of the house. The walls around her seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker, deeper. She could feel the weight of something she couldn't name pressing down on her, an oppressive force that seemed to push her further away from the world she once knew. Isabelle backed away from the mirror, her hands trembling. She felt a shiver run through her, a bone-deep chill that left her feeling hollow and insubstantial, like a ghost trapped in her own home. She stumbled into the living room, sinking onto the couch as the weight of everything crashed over her. She felt lost, adrift in a world that no longer seemed to recognize her. The silence pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating, wrapping around her like a shroud. As she sat there, staring into the emptiness, she whispered into the silence, her voice small and fragile, "Please, let someone hear me." But the house remained still, silent, and unyielding, a cold and indifferent witness to her fading presence.